In the early summer of 1912, Villisca, Iowa, was the kind of town where the days moved slowly and predictably. Set amid rolling farmland, its streets were lined with modest homes, small businesses, and churches that served as the center of community life. Neighbors knew one another by name. Doors were often left unlocked. Trouble, when it came, was usually small and quickly resolved. At the heart of the town stood the Moore residence, a simple two-story wooden house located at the intersection of 6th Street and 2nd Avenue. It was home to Josiah Moore, a respected local businessman who operated a farm implement store, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. The Moore family was known to be orderly, devout, and well-regarded. They attended church regularly and were active participants in community events. On Sunday, June 9, 1912, the day unfolded without incident. That evening, the Moore family attended a Children's Day program at the local Presbyterian church. 2 additional children, Lena and Ina Stillinger, sisters who lived nearby, joined the Moore children after the service. It was not unusual for visiting children to stay overnight in Villisca, especially after church gatherings. By all accounts, the evening ended peacefully. Sometime after 9 p.m., the Moore family and their guests returned to the house. Lamps were extinguished, doors were secured, and the household settled into sleep. Outside, Villisca was quiet. No unusual sounds were reported. No disturbances were noted. The town passed into the early hours of Monday morning, unaware that something irreversible had already begun. The Moore house stood dark through the night. Curtains were drawn. Windows were covered. Inside, the occupants remained in their beds. What occurred during those hours would later become the subject of intense scrutiny, speculation, and debate. But at the time, there was nothing to suggest that the night would be remembered for anything other than its stillness. The following morning, Monday, June 10, began as an ordinary weekday. Stores opened. Residents went about their routines. Yet by mid-morning, small irregularities began to draw attention. Josiah Moore had not opened his shop. The children had not arrived at school. Curtains in the Moore house remained closed later than usual. Around 8 a.m., neighbors grew concerned. Several attempts were made to contact the family by knocking at the door, but there was no response. The house appeared locked. Eventually, a neighbor, Mary Peckham, approached the home and noticed that the door was secured from the inside. After further hesitation, she contacted the town marshal, Henry Horton. Marshal Horton arrived shortly thereafter. He attempted entry through the front door and found it locked. A key was retrieved from Josiah Moore's brother, Ross Moore, who lived nearby. When the door was finally opened, the scene inside immediately raised alarm. The house was unnaturally silent. The air was heavy. Windows were covered with clothing and cloths, blocking daylight from entering. As Horton moved through the rooms, he made a discovery that would permanently mark the town of Villisca. In the downstairs bedroom, Josiah and Sarah Moore were found in their bed. Upstairs, the 4 Moore children lay in their room. In a separate upstairs bedroom, Lena and Ina Stillinger were also present. No one in the house was responsive. The arrangement of the room suggested that no one had fled, and no signs of forced entry were immediately apparent. Word spread quickly. Villisca residents gathered outside the house, drawn by confusion and concern. The sheriff was notified. Doctors arrived. What began as unease turned into collective shock. By mid-morning, it was clear that the entire household had been overcome during the night. Authorities attempted to secure the home, but in the early hours, proper procedures were poorly understood. Neighbors, officials, and curious onlookers entered and exited freely. Items were moved, windows were opened. The scene was compromised almost immediately. Despite this, certain details stood out. All of the occupants appeared to have been approached while they slept. No signs of prolonged struggle were evident. The layout of the house suggested a methodical movement from room to room. The absence of noise raised questions about timing and familiarity. Outside the house, the town struggled to process what had occurred. Villisca had never experienced anything comparable. The idea that such an event could take place without alerting anyone nearby was difficult to reconcile with the town's sense of security. By afternoon, news began to travel beyond the town. Reporters arrived. Officials from neighboring counties took interest. Villisca was no longer just a quiet farming community. It had become the center of a case that would defy explanation. What happened inside the Moore house during the night hours remained unknown. No witnesses came forward. No immediate explanation presented itself. Yet one thing was certain: the events of that night would not be resolved quickly, if at all. The investigation was only beginning. Once the initial shock subsided, authorities began the task of examining the Moore residence more carefully. By late morning on June 10, 1912, the house had become the focal point of the town. Law enforcement officials from Montgomery County arrived, followed later by state investigators. What they found raised as many questions as it answered. The structure itself was modest and practical. Built of wood, the two-story house contained a downstairs bedroom, kitchen, dining room, and sitting room, with 2 bedrooms upstairs. There were no signs of forced entry. Doors were locked, windows were covered, not broken. Whoever entered the home did so quietly and deliberately. The downstairs bedroom held Josiah and Sarah Moore. They were discovered in their bed, positioned as if they had been asleep. Nearby, the guest room upstairs contained Lena and Ina Stillinger, while the Moore children were found together in their own room. The arrangement suggested that the intruder or intruders had moved through the house in a systematic way. Investigators noted that all window shades and curtains had been drawn. In some cases, clothing had been placed over windows, further blocking light. This appeared intentional, suggesting a desire to keep the interior concealed from outside view, both during the night and afterward. In the kitchen, a single plate of food was discovered, uneaten. A bowl of water sat nearby. These details prompted speculation that someone may have paused in the house after the occupants were already asleep. Whether this indicated familiarity with the home or simply opportunity was unclear. One object quickly drew attention: an axe belonging to Josiah Moore. It was found inside the house, cleaned and placed near the staircase. Investigators believed it had been taken from the home's tool shed. The condition of the tool suggested it had been wiped down before being left behind. Despite this, no fingerprints could be identified. At the time, fingerprinting was still an emerging science, not widely practiced or standardized. As a result, the potential value of physical evidence was limited from the outset. Further examination revealed that mirrors in the house had been covered with cloth. This unusual detail sparked immediate debate. Some investigators believed it reflected superstition. Others thought it might have been done to avoid reflections during the night. No consensus was reached. Another puzzling aspect was the lack of disturbance. Furniture remained largely in place. Personal items were untouched. Money was not taken. The absence of theft suggested that the event was not motivated by financial gain. As the hours passed, the house continued to draw attention. Despite attempts to restrict access, townspeople, officials, and reporters entered freely. Some walked through rooms. Others opened drawers or moved items in an effort to understand what had occurred. This uncontrolled access severely compromised the integrity of the site. By early afternoon, the decision was made to move the occupants from the house. They were taken to a local undertaking establishment. The Moore home was closed, but by then, much of its original condition had already been altered. Outside, speculation began almost immediately. Villisca residents struggled to reconcile the orderly nature of the town with the nature of the discovery. The idea that no one had heard anything unusual during the night was difficult to accept. Some questioned whether sounds could have been mistaken for normal household activity. Others wondered if weather conditions had masked noise. That night, a severe storm had passed through the area. Thunder and heavy rain were reported. Investigators later considered whether this might have concealed activity outside or inside the house. The timing, however, remained uncertain. Attention soon turned to who might have known the family's routines. Josiah Moore was a well-known businessman. His work brought him into contact with customers from surrounding areas. He had also recently been involved in local disputes related to business competition. Some wondered whether resentment or disagreement could have played a role. At the same time, others focused on the visitors. The presence of the Stillinger sisters raised questions, not because of suspicion toward them, but because their presence appeared unplanned. Why they were included in the events of the night would later become a point of discussion. Investigators attempted to establish a timeline. The family had returned home from church sometime after 9 p.m. Neighbors reported nothing unusual during the late evening hours. The discovery occurred shortly after 8 a.m. The interval between these times became the central focus of inquiry. Despite extensive discussion, no immediate suspect emerged. There were no witnesses who reported seeing anyone approach or leave the house. No clear footprints were preserved. Weather conditions and foot traffic had erased any traces outside. As news of the case spread beyond Villisca, public interest grew rapidly. Newspapers across the Midwest carried headlines about the quiet town and the unanswered questions inside a locked house. Reporters speculated freely, often without confirmed information. For investigators, the challenge was clear. The scene offered few definitive answers, and much of what might have been useful had already been disturbed. What remained were fragments, details that could suggest intent, but not identity. The case had moved beyond the walls of the Moore house. It now belonged to the wider public, where rumor and assumption would soon complicate the search for clarity. The focus shifted from what had been found to who might have been responsible. As the investigation progressed beyond the Moore residence, attention shifted from the physical scene to the people connected to it. With no clear evidence pointing in a single direction, authorities were forced to consider multiple possibilities, often based on circumstantial details, personal histories, and community tensions. One of the earliest lines of inquiry involved individuals who had passed through Villisca in the days surrounding June 9, 1912. Josiah Moore was a traveling businessman, and his work brought him into contact with salesmen, competitors, and customers from neighboring towns. Investigators reviewed his recent appointments and business dealings, searching for disagreements or unresolved conflicts. A traveling preacher named Reverend George Kelly quickly became a person of interest. Kelly had arrived in Villisca shortly before the events and departed soon afterward. He was known to wander from town to town, giving sermons and requesting lodging. Witnesses reported that he had attended the same church service as the Moore family on the evening of June 9. Kelly's behavior drew attention for several reasons. He was described as intense and unpredictable. During questioning, he gave inconsistent statements about his movements that night. At one point, he admitted to being near the Moore home after midnight, claiming he was suffering from insomnia and had gone for a walk. Authorities detained Kelly on multiple occasions. He was subjected to lengthy questioning and eventually made a statement that appeared to place him inside the house. However, this statement was later recanted, and concerns were raised about the methods used during interrogation. No physical evidence could be linked to him, and no charges were filed. Another avenue of investigation centered on Josiah Moore's business rivalries. Moore had recently secured a position as the exclusive representative of a farm equipment company in the area. This decision reportedly displaced another salesman, creating tension within the local business community. Investigators interviewed competitors and reviewed correspondence, but no direct threats or hostile actions were uncovered. While resentment may have existed, there was nothing to suggest that it escalated beyond professional disagreement. Attention also turned toward members of the Moore family's social circle. Friends, neighbors, and church acquaintances were questioned extensively. The focus was not on accusation, but on understanding patterns, who knew the family's habits, who might have been aware of the Stillinger girl's visit, and who had reason to be near the house that evening. Despite the thoroughness of these interviews, they produced little of substance. Villisca residents described the Moores as private, but well regarded. No disputes, feuds, or unusual behavior emerged from these accounts. The possibility of a transient individual was also considered. Rail lines passed near Villisca, and the area occasionally saw people traveling through in search of work. Some investigators theorized that someone unfamiliar to the town could have entered unnoticed and left before dawn. This theory, however, raised its own difficulties. Navigating the house without creating disturbance suggested familiarity. The deliberate actions observed inside covering mirrors, blocking windows, selecting a tool from the property did not align easily with the idea of a random intruder acting impulsively. Another troubling aspect was the timing. The person responsible appeared to have waited until all occupants were asleep. This patience implied planning. Whether that planning was long-term or opportunistic remained unclear. As months passed, the investigation lost momentum. Leads were pursued and abandoned. Interviews were repeated. Rumors circulated freely, often reshaping facts into speculation. Each new theory seemed to generate more questions rather than answers. Public confidence in the investigation began to waver. Newspapers criticized law enforcement for failing to produce results. Editorials debated whether mistakes had been made in the early hours, particularly regarding the lack of scene control. In 1916, the case was reopened under new leadership. Fresh eyes reviewed old testimony. Some witnesses were re-interviewed and previous suspects were reconsidered. Despite renewed effort, no definitive breakthroughs occurred. The Reverend Kelly was again questioned and at one point charged, but the case against him collapsed under scrutiny. Without reliable evidence, the legal system could not proceed. By this stage, the case had become more than an unresolved inquiry. It had entered public consciousness as a mystery defined by uncertainty. Each suspect carried unanswered questions, but none could be conclusively tied to the events inside the Moore house. What remained was a collection of possibilities rather than conclusions. Familiarity versus randomness. Planning versus coincidence. Silence versus oversight. The investigation had revealed the limits of early 20th century methods. Without modern forensic tools, much depended on memory, observation, and interpretation. When those proved insufficient, the search for clarity stalled. As time moved on, Villisca returned to routine life, but the case did not fade. It lingered, unresolved, waiting for an explanation that never arrived. The focus now shifted from solving the case to understanding its lasting impact on the town, on the families involved, and on the broader conversation about unresolved crimes. In the years following the events of June 1912, the case gradually shifted from an active investigation into a permanent uncertainty. With no arrests sustained and no verdict ever delivered, responsibility for understanding what happened passed from law enforcement to history. The Moore residence was eventually returned to the family. Josiah Moore's relatives attempted to move forward, but the house itself became a physical reminder of unanswered questions. For a time, it stood vacant. Residents avoided passing it at night, and children were warned not to linger nearby. The structure had not changed, yet its meaning had. Public attention returned in waves. Whenever a new suspect emerged, newspapers revisited the case. Each revival followed the same pattern: renewed hope, intense scrutiny, and eventual disappointment. No new evidence surfaced that could withstand examination. In 1916, a grand jury was convened to reconsider earlier findings. Witnesses were recalled, statements reviewed, and theories debated. Despite the effort, the proceedings ended without resolution. The legal process reached its limit. The absence of conclusive proof made further action impossible. Over time, The Villisca case began to influence how similar investigations were approached. Law enforcement agencies cited it as an example of the consequences of delayed scene control and incomplete documentation. While these observations came too late to alter the outcome, they contributed to gradual changes in investigative practice. The town itself carried the weight quietly. Villisca did not seek notoriety, yet it became linked permanently to the case. Visitors arrived asking questions locals could not answer. Residents learned to separate daily life from the past, even as the story remained present in conversation and memory. Decades later, the house was restored. Care was taken to preserve its original layout, not as a spectacle but as a historical record. Each room reflected how ordinary the setting had been. That ordinariness became central to the case's significance. Nothing about the house suggested what occurred within it. Historians approached the case with caution. Without definitive conclusions, responsible accounts focused on verified facts rather than speculation. The timeline, the physical evidence, and the investigative steps were documented, while conclusions were deliberately withheld. As the 20th century progressed, the case entered a broader cultural context. It became part of a growing public interest in unresolved historical events. Unlike cases resolved through confession or conviction, Villisca resisted closure. Its endurance lay in what could not be proven. Families connected to the case aged and passed away. First-hand memory disappeared. What remained were records, photographs, and testimony preserved in archives. Interpretation replaced recollection. Occasionally, new theories were proposed, often reflecting the concerns of their time. Some emphasized social tensions, others focused on psychological explanations. Each theory offered perspective, but none delivered certainty. What distinguished the Villisca case was not complexity, but absence. No single mistake, no overlooked confession, no hidden document has ever emerged to settle the matter. The investigation reached an edge beyond which it could not proceed. In this way, the case became a study in limits of evidence, of memory, and of certainty. It illustrated how even thorough inquiry can fail when essential pieces are missing. Today, Villisca remains a quiet town. The house still stands. Its presence is neither ignored nor sensationalized by those who live nearby. It exists as part of local history, acknowledged but not explained. The legacy of the case is not found in conclusions, but in caution. It reminds us that not every question yields an answer, and not every story reaches resolution. Some remain suspended, defined by what cannot be known. More than a century later, the events of that night are still examined, not to assign blame, but to understand how uncertainty shapes collective memory. The silence left behind continues to speak. This is not a story of solutions. It is a record of facts, preserved where explanation ends, and in that space the case remains unresolved.